Go for it.
Tell me about the Spook Chair.
Well, to go back just a little bit, I'm the only person I know of who's held both major psychic fellowships for doing psychic work in the United States. One was at Harvard, and that was the Hodgson Fund. Hodgson was a parapsychologist who came over from England, a good friend of William James. And so he and William James investigated the medium Lenore Piper, among other things. And when he died suddenly, William James got together money and established what's called the Hodgson Fund, which was supposed to be administered by Harvard for people who do psychical research. And when I was at Harvard in the 50s, I was given that fund by the psychology department. I didn't ask for it. They gave it to me. They were looking for some unembarrassing way to find someone who would do something with it without embarrassment. They didn't want any psychics, pro-psychics or parapsychologists. So I was given that, and that's how we did that's why I did my first book on water witching. That finances my studies on water witching, which always was an accident. That's another story. Then when I came to Oregon, I had learned I knew about the Thomas Welton Stanford Chair for Psychical Research. That's the official title at Stanford University. Thomas Welton Stanford was the brother of Leland Stanford, the railroad magnate who created Stanford University. That's Stanford University, named after him. His brother went to Australia and made himself a fortune there in Australia, Thomas Welton Stanford. While in Australia, he became a spiritualist, in other words, he attended seances and believed in the spiritualist mediums, and was a big supporter of it. In those days, he got very seasick when he got on a boat. There wasn't transatlantic flights. So he knew he wasn't going to be able to come back to the United States, but he had a big fortune. So he decided to leave it to his brother's university, Stanford University, and he decided to leave it for psychical research. Now, the president of Stanford University was what today would be a wonderful skeptic. He was, I'm trying to think of his name now, but he was a person who had been the first to expose that rainmakers in California. Showed that they're really frauds and how they work. And he was the president of Stanford University, and he wasn't too keen on having all this money for just doing psychical research. So he sent his lawyers, very clever lawyers, to Australia, and he had these lawyers convince Thomas Welton Stanford that in the United States we don't call it psychical research, we call it psychological research. With some truth to it a little bit, because some people confuse it too. And as a result, the money was left for psychological research. And at that time, Stanford Psychology Department suddenly had a grant, amount of money that, in total, eclipsed the combined research money for all the other sciences at Stanford. Psychology Department was the richest department in the world, and they still are. They now are still considered one of the top psychology departments of all time. They still are. And part of that is because they had that psychic research. Now, they had some guilt because they realized, they knew that it was supposed to be for psychical research. So they set aside a little bit of the money to set up a chair. And they set up a chair for psychical research. And the first man they appointed was a man named Coover. And Coover did, for his first few years, he did some psychical research. He investigated mediums and stuff like that. And he found it all was he became a big skeptic, you know. I still have his book, which is this thick, that he wrote, summarizing stuff. But for the rest of his time, I think he retired finally in '38. He began in 1960 or before that with this chair. And so by the time he retired, he was not doing any psychical research. But the parapsychologists were very upset because they knew this money was supposed to be for psychical research, and Stanford wasn't spending it that way. Stanford didn't want to do this. The psychology department especially didn't want to get involved with psychic stuff. But they decided, well, they would set up, instead of when this guy Coover retired, they would set up, instead of a new chair, they would set up a visiting position. So every year they would bring in a new person to hold that chair for that year. And that began, but they brought in just regular psychologists who did psychophysics and stuff like that, not doing, and the parapsychologists created a big clamor, and And so they try to bring in people who do something that could be considered relevant to parapsychology. Well, this, went off and on. They sometimes didn't do anything with it. And I was having a sabbatical coming up in about 1982, I think. And I just said, Locke, I just was thinking of that chair. And so I called Gordon Bauer, who's the chairman of the psychology department at Stanford. I says, Gordon, can you tell me something? What's happened to the Thomas Weldon Stanford Chair for Psychical Research? Without any further ado, he said, Ray, you want that chair, it's yours. You have it. So I went the next year and held, there they call it the Spook Chair, and I held the Spook Chair for a year.
That's great. Okay, let's end. Wait, don't. Are you going to cut?
And it's,
At Stanford.
yeah, and they don't show, you get a special waivers to see it. And I was one of the few people allowed to go see the collection of apports that Thomas Weldon Stanford deeded to his university. They are paper mache arrows and stuff like that were reported during a seance in Australia. He sent them all to Stanford. They have it, but they don't want anyone to see it. They're embarrassed by it. So they keep it in a vault underground, under the library, way deep down underground. And I was able to see it while I was there.